Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining my book chat. My name is Melody, and I am your host. And you can find my book chat every Wednesday on my Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube channel. And you can also find the replays on these channels as well. I want to give a special shout out to the Alice Keeler teacher tech community who might be tuning in tonight. Tonight is a special night because the book we are discussing, The Fire Within Lessons from Defeat That Have Inspired a Passion for Learning, changed the trajectory of my life. It opened the door to publishing, the relationship with EduMatch Publishing, and the learning the writing process and loving it. The editor, author, and connector of stories, Mandy Froehlich, had a vision. She cast a net on Twitter and maybe other socials to find authors, and I and a few others answer the call. Tonight, we revisit the book, what it means for today, how it has impacted some of the contributing authors who are able to join us tonight. We'll not only hear from Mandy, but also Jennifer Casa-Todd, Dene, Gainey, and Jarod, Bormann, and even myself as we all contributed stories. Mandy, thank you for coming back on my book chat tonight. I love going live with you, and I want to begin by asking you, how are you doing, and why did you think the Fire Within project was important?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. You know that you're one of my favorite people to go live with. So I absolutely love being here and so honored that you wanted to get together as well, because of course I have a special place in my heart for the contributors of The Fire Within and would do anything for them because every single one of them was amazing. And so I'm doing well. This really was one of the catalysts for moving my career forward into that space. And it's given me so much personal satisfaction. Like The Fire Within really is one of my favorite books that I've written. And so I love it. And I think why the project was important was because we all contributed to this book at a time where people were not talking about educator mental health. Like that was not a thing. And I knew as an educator that I had to keep my own mental health and my own adversity experience under wraps because it wasn't something we talked about. And I felt like the work that I had done prior to The Fire Within was really just the start of trying to destigmatize, trying to bring mental health issues for teachers to light, whether they've happened because of education or outside of education. And so that's why, The Fire Within was probably one of my biggest works of art. Really putting all of us out there inadvertently
Yeah.
in these stories. And and so that's why it's so important to me.
Yeah, and so what was kind of like, what was the feedback you got? Because it really did start the conversation. And so being kind of the first person to be so vulnerable, what was the impact of that for you?
I think that the impact actually started prior to The Fire Within with a blog post that I had written that had gone viral. And it was about, I basically spewed a bunch of stuff about my mental health into a blog post and shot it off and got a lot of responses about it. And I think that what it did was it really highlighted for me the power of vulnerability. And I knew from being one of the people with mental health issues that when somebody says to you, that happens to me too, that makes you feel not alone. And being alone in a mental health issue is one of the worst places to be, or that feeling of being alone. And so I think from that standpoint, that the idea of vulnerability being a weakness in that case really kind of flipped the narrative. We flipped the narrative with the book and taking vulnerability and being like, no, this is actually a strength. We're willing to talk about this, and we're willing to put ourselves out there and kind of criticize what you want. Like we did it, and every single story in The Fire Within takes an element of being human and discusses it in a way that feels like open and impactful. And that's what I love so much about the project.
I do too. And I just know that when I read it and when I got to read everybody's story besides my own, I cried like crazy. And I was just so proud to be such a part of such a piece of a project, a compilation of stories where people really came out of the ashes. So I'm curious, how did you choose the stories to go with The Fire Within?
Yeah. So, um, it was actually, I tried to make it, and I always recommend this to everybody, especially if they do books with people's narratives in it. The one thing that I wanted to avoid was having to judge somebody's story. Like that was the one thing that I wanted so badly to stay away from, because I did
Right.
not want anyone to say, this is my trauma story. And for me to have to be the one to say,
Right.
that's not good enough for a book,
Right.
you know? So like, no, that was not going to
You
happen.
didn't
So
suffer enough to make the cut. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
no, like that wasn't going to be a thing. So I tried to pull in as much of my teacher as I could, and as you know, there was a rubric that went along with it, and if you were willing to tell your story and you were willing to follow the rubric and put in the elements that I felt were an important part of any narrative, those elements being, you know, the adversity that or trauma that happened, bringing it back around to how that has improved your teaching practice, why this is important to other humans, like those types of things were in the rubric. And so basically, like I did work with some contributors more than others to kind of streamline their stories and make sure that as a reader that it made sense and was you know I was able to follow it and things like that.
Right.
But as long as really as they had those elements in there, it was accepted. The thing was is that I had a lot of people who wanted to submit, that it wasn't that they couldn't follow the rubric, it was that it was really difficult for them to tell their stories, and they thought it would be easier than it actually ended up being. And so I had lots and lots of people who reached out to me and said, I really want to submit for your book, and I'm like, that's awesome, here's what you have to do. But at the end of the day, it's a very healing, but a very emotionally draining process to go
Yes.
through and write it down. And so I think from that standpoint, you know, there were some people whose stories ultimately weren't, but it was by their choice.
Right. I know that we talked a little bit about this before we went live, but like I actually can't read my story. I can't read it because so much has changed since I've written it that I almost
Hmm.
feel like I have to eat my words. I feel like when I wrote it, and every we always, if you're a writer, you there's always things you want to change about it and
Yeah.
update. But I feel like even though at the time I thought what I wrote about was the worst I'd ever gone through, when this book published 2 weeks later, my husband went through quadruple bypass emergency, and, I felt like I needed to eat those words, like, "Oh, yeah, we should appreciate the challenges," you know? But honestly, it kind of made me cling to that, like, you can't quit, like, you have to find a way to keep going, but it's a little bit jarring for me to go back when I thought that I had already faced probably what was gonna be the hardest. Really, life is not like that. You're gonna be thrown challenges, again and again, and I actually read everybody's, that is gonna join us tonight, including yours. I read your, story over, and I'm just curious, how did The Fire Within impact or change you? Because 'Cause I'm gonna ask everybody this tonight.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to go back to what you said a little bit. I think one of the things that, you know, when we talked about some of the things that are in the fire within, like one of my, I don't know, regret would be too strong of a word, but something along those lines would be using the term superpowers. And for a couple of reasons, mainly because it gives the impression that we need to expect superpowers out of teachers, which we should not. They are
Right,
human like everyone else. But also that somehow going through a trauma, you know, that we should appreciate it and love it and all of those kinds of things. And and I think that from that standpoint, like we were talking about things people weren't talking about. Like we
right.
didn't have the words to really express what it was that we wanted to say. And so over time, like when I look back at the fire within, I still love it and all of those things, but I can
Yes.
pick out those little things that I probably wouldn't say again. Not because they're not valid, but just because they're not said maybe in the way that I would wordsmith, let's put it like that. But like I said, we didn't have the words really to talk about it at the time. Um, And so I think, from that standpoint, the fire within really, it gave me the courage to continue to do this work. And every time that I got a message from somebody that said, I read The Fire Within and, it touched me in this way, or somebody's story was really important to me, or I, resonated with this story, it gave me the courage to continue to talk about it at a time where I was being told never to talk about it.
Mhm.
And so I needed that courage. Like I needed that, that validation at the time. And so from that standpoint, it was an invaluable experience.
And was it the first book that you wrote? I know it's not the last.
It's the first book I released. So I was writing The Fire Within and Divergent EDU in tandem, like I was writing them at the same time. And we released Fire Within, and then we released Reignite the Flames. And actually, one of the reasons why we released Reignite the Flames so quickly after The Fire Within was because I got so much response from The Fire Within that I was in danger of secondary traumatic stress from listening to other people's responses to the book, because they would tell me their trauma stories. And so we released Divergent EDU quickly after that in order to actually shift the focus onto that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's incredible, and I'm so glad that you didn't stop. I can't even imagine, feeling all of that and continuing to go. I'm so glad you did. We're gonna bring up, an author, one of the contributing authors, but before we do, I asked you if you would pick out just one little part of The Fire Within, just to read, and then we're gonna bring up our first contributing author.
Yeah, for sure. And this is a really short piece, but I do also want to read. So, one of my favorite things about The Fire Within is I did a student poetry submission
Yes.
for The Fire Within. And well, it was a student and adult, like anybody could submit, but students are predominantly featured in The Fire Within. And Brian Costello, one of our other authors for EduMatch, his students were a big contributing factor to the book. And so we had kind of this contest for which ones were going to be included in the end. I included almost all of them because I
Mhm.
could not choose, but some of them were highlighted throughout the book. And so I'm going to read one of those, and then I'm going to read just a page from the book. So this poem is You Flame by Courtney Fuso, age 13. Why pretend to be water for someone who is too afraid to handle being stepped on? That flame that continues to grow from every single blow, every single throw, you feel an afterglow. Igniting inside, you overcame, you flame. So that was from Miss Courtney.
I
So this is chapter 1.
Oh.
Yeah, love that. I can barely get through the student poems without crying. So I'm already tearing up. They're really the student poetry. There's an entire section in the back that teachers, if you have this book, you could pull from this and you could use their examples as poetry pieces for writing about adversity and trauma. So I highly recommend that you check that out. So chapter 1, beginning with the end. Something very beautiful happens to people when their world has fallen apart. A humility, a nobility, a higher intelligence emerges at just the point when our knees hit the floor. Marianne Williamson. It's always at the end when everything becomes clear. The reason for heartache, distress, and anxiety can be seen. The decisions that might have been different had you only known what was about to happen. Hindsight being 2020 and all that. Going through a difficult time in adversity can be like that. It's only at the end, when you've relentlessly worked through the multitude of internal struggles, that you can see the silver linings. One of my most fundamental life beliefs is that our stories and our life experiences shape who we are. Every decision, reaction, or relationship we have or create is directed and defined by our past experiences and how we have reacted to the adversity that has happened in our lives. Our stories can be so powerful that they can dictate all future interactions, and our reactions to them can either be detrimental to our well-being or inspirational and motivational to the people around us. Sometimes they are a combination of the two, and we continue our struggles while we work for the good of others. People always show their true character in the moments when life gets difficult. It's not adversity itself that defines a person, it's how they react to the situation. Every reaction is a choice we make. Sometimes people choose to live in the darkness of sorrow and hurt, to carry that with them and allow it to spur on anger and resentment, or use it as a reason to hurt other people the way they've been hurt. But others find their way through the darkness and use their experience as a springboard for helping others find their way as well, whether it be counselors, doctors, nurses, or in our case, educators.
I love that so much. Thank you for sharing that. And really, is that not the definition of humanity? Like we're never going to be like an all light, 100% comfort, happiness. There's
Mhm.
always going to be a challenge after another. And it's really how we deal with those. And, no one's perfect. Sometimes it takes us longer to find our way out. And like you said,
Yep.
sometimes people never do. So
Mhm.
if we actually make it to the other side, like that's pretty powerful. And if we help others make it to the other side, even more so. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing. I know that it is emotional to go back and read those words, and they
It
are still
is.
true today. So I'm so glad. Our first contributing author that we're bringing up is our dear friend, Dene Gainey, and he has been with me on my book chat several times. Dean, it's so great to see you. I'm so glad you are back. Can you tell us a little bit about your story, The Power Within, that you wrote for The Fire Within, and then we'll go from there.
So I have to tell you, there's a few things in this chapter that, having reflected back on it, are really, really, excuse me.
Bless you.
I
Bless
didn't
you.
expect that to happen. Oh my gosh. Okay, so that story centers on a topic that, like you guys have already talked about, just vulnerability. And so just thinking back on how honest I really was about
Yes.
rejection.
You were very
Um,
honest. I went back and
yeah.
read your story, but it reminded me of why you are such a generous soul, but that's all I'll say.
Yeah. So, for whatever the reason is, it's really hard to always put a finger on why you walk down paths of feeling like you're rejected by people for a variety of reasons. And sometimes it could just be in your head, or sometimes you've gone through that so many times that you don't know. You weren't able to tell what the real reason is why you're walking through that. And so looking back on the story of rejection, maybe based on the who I am and what I am as an African American male, just thinking back on how sometimes misinterpretations and judgment that is passed without taking the time to really get to know who a person is, it just reminds me how important it is to really take the time to give people an opportunity to show you who they are. I think Maya Angelou said it right. When people show you who they are, believe them, but you got to give them a chance, right? So that story of rejection, it was definitely a hard thing. And so reflecting back on it now and looking at it now, I'm thinking, gosh, I wonder how important that was for me to say it, so that now I can look back on it and say, I'm not there anymore. And that is not to say that I don't still experience seemingly rejection here and there from various areas, but I don't think the same way about that rejection now. And I think being able to say it and read it and go back and say, oh my gosh, maybe it was necessary. Maybe it was the thing I needed to get out so that I could look back and say, wow, I've grown. I've used that rejection to be able to launch myself into a different place today. I've learned that adversity can lead, and this is something I kind of coined, but adversity can lead to university. And what do I mean when I say university? Obviously, we think about schools we go to for college, but when I think about university, I think about the opportunity to learn from that adversity. So adversity leads me to university. And then university, I'm finding, even with sharing in Mandy's book and hearing everybody else's stories, is that now we can have what you call communiversity, which is a new term that I don't know where it came from, but I'm hoping to write about it, communiversity, because now we get to say, we're not the only ones dealing with that. And getting it out and sharing it brings us to the table, right? It brings us to the table. I'm also just reminded that opposition is usually, that thing that pushes you forward. You experience that and you're like, okay, I'm gonna keep trying. I'm gonna keep pushing. Maybe there's something in that opposition that I need. And looking back on it now, I know it was. Like, I'm not the same Dean that I was when I went through that. I think that's probably the power of the moment. So I don't know. I think the story in and of itself is a reminder that sometimes the traumatic and adverse experiences we go through are not always bad if we allow ourselves to see it as an opportunity for growth and progress.
Mm-hmm. I love that you kind of answered the question, how did the fire within impact or change you? And I appreciate that. You are a leader, and I look up to you a lot. And I think your example of integrity is, true, tried and true. And so I appreciate your vulnerability. And I actually think your story resonates with a lot of people, because there's a lot of people that, whether they have been rejected or they just feel rejected. I mean, rejection is a powerful force, and it doesn't feel good at all. But yeah, Mandy, did you want to add anything?
I think that, like I kind of put in our private chat, like, how many times am I going to tear up this episode? Because I love so much about what you said. And I always thought that your story was so powerful because I feel like a lot of us can connect with that element of rejection, or feeling like, or even wondering if we're actually being rejected, or
Yes.
if it's something else entirely, and it's a terrible feeling. And there was so much adversity that came also from parents in your story, where it was like misunderstandings of things that were happening, and a lack of communication between the parent and you, like communicating with you and not seeing all the amazing things that you were doing for students, and misinterpreting what was happening. And that I feel is something that so many teachers can relate to as well, in times where we're just trying to do our best and we're trying to be there for students, and all of a sudden there's somebody that doesn't understand what we're doing, and we're all of a sudden defending ourselves. And so I think that from that standpoint, your story is really powerful as well.
Yeah, and Dean, before I bring up another contributing author, is there anything else you'd like to share about the fire within, or just a wisdom that you've come along through the years since it's been published?
Well, I quite honestly, I guess I would say it's important to live that, and I guess come to grips with the idea that it is adverse, or that it may have been traumatic. But it's also important to realize that just as we're all here, all of our stories in that book, we're still here. I think so much power in the fact that we are still here, and we're still doing what we do the best that we can, and we are our best selves. We are the only one that get a chance. We are the only ones that get a chance to be ourselves, right? Nobody can do that but us. And so I think that's the power in it, is that, yeah, I went through that, and the story has been told. It needs to be told, but don't stay there. Don't allow it to keep you stuck.
Right. Agreed. Well, thank you so much. If you don't go away, I'll bring you back up in just a little bit, but we are so grateful that you shared your story, and we'll see you in just a few more minutes. Our next contributing author, do you want to share a little bit about our next contributing author? I know that she's like your dearest friend, Mandy.
Yeah. So Jen contributed to the book before we understood we were soul sisters. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, we actually are best friends. We're best friends right now. And so I think from that standpoint, I couldn't ask for like two of my favorite people right now to be on this show together. And just Jen, from the standpoint, like, there's probably nobody on earth that understands or knows me better than her. So just happy she can be here tonight, knowing she has all the things happening right now, and she's taking time out for this. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah,
I'm going to tell you, wait, today is World Gratitude Day. And honestly, this is the best way to end my day. I'm so grateful listening to Dean, listening to you both, being a part of this. Awesome. Day made.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Thanks.
you got really vulnerable. Will you share a little bit about what it means out of the darkness, what your chapter was about?
Absolutely. So I didn't know which way to go when Mandy first asked me to contribute. I have a really dark childhood story. I was severely bullied, and I sat in front of my computer and thought, I'm going to write that story. And then I decided, no, I was so impacted by having a concussion in 2016 and 17 and was out for 10 months. And some people didn't even know I was out. You know how life gets so busy and then you're like, oh, I haven't seen you in a while. I'm like, yeah, you haven't seen me in 10 months. I've been in a dark room. So that basically my chapter Out of Darkness is literally me grappling with mild traumatic brain injury and how I felt, not just the physical, physiological aspects of it, but also the emotional pieces, which I never ever knew about or anticipated. The mood swings, the depression, the social anxiety, all of those things that I never associated as being part of having a concussion. So my story talks about that, and it was really important for me to write down my experience. Also, there's a part in the chapter where I talk about what the actual symptoms are, because after I had a concussion, I met so many kids in my school who were suffering through the same thing, and some people didn't believe them. Because when you think about a concussion, it's like so many of the adversities that come up in the book. They're not things you can see. There's not a cast on my leg, my head, my heart, right? It's invisible. And so I really think as educators that we need to know a little bit more about some of the trauma that associates concussions and what that looks like. And of course, that looks like something different for everyone. But I felt it was so cathartic for me to be able to share that story. And also afterwards, people came up to me and said, I had no idea, or thank you for sharing that, or I too suffered that. And so that was really significant to me as well. Being able to share that and to feel in many ways that other people understand it a little bit better.
Do you think about like that 10 months still? Does it still come up to you? Just like, gosh,
So I have a really bad working memory still as a result of my concussion. But do you know that it came up today? I think I'm going to cry. So we have these beanbag chairs in the library, and I was in another room, and I saw out of the corner of my eye a kid dive into the beanbag chairs towards the corner, and I got up and lost it. I am not a yelling person. I never yell. And I said to him, do you have any idea what could have happened to you right now? You could have had a concussion. I was lying in a dark room for 10 months. And he was like, I'm sorry, Miss Casa-Todd. And everyone went quiet. Like the whole library hushed because I never yelled. Crying. And I thought, wow, clearly, subliminally, or on a very deep level, this is still something that's really impacting me, because I have to find that student tomorrow and apologize to him for being for yelling, but it really, really does still obviously impact me. Today was an example.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a perfect example, though, of dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder from something, right? Like, I too have had those moments where I've lost it for what a reason that feels like is not okay to lose it for. And yet all you can think about is somebody else repeating the thing that you did that made you miserable and that gave you this trauma and all of those kinds of things. And if there's like Jen's story is one of the stories that people repeatedly say to me, I really connected with Jen's story. And I think because so many people have had these concussions or some sort of, mild traumatic brain injury, and it's just not it is sort of it's not a mental health issue, and yet it's very much looked at like a mental health issue, where because you can't see it, it's not there.
Yeah.
And also some people can still do it and be like seem high functioning in the moment, and so you don't necessarily understand what's actually happening underneath. And so I think for that reason, a lot of people connected with Jen's story.
And I just saw Stephanie,
Yes.
her comment. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you, Stephanie, for watching. And I'm so glad that this resonated with you. When I was reading your story, Jen, I was just like, the things that we take for granted, our health, we're so busy doing all of our things, and then bam, something knocks us out. And you were literally knocked to for 10 months. And then when you went back, because you're trying to be who you were, and you said you put your makeup on, you looked like who you used to be, but you're trying so hard to do your job and you're not. But you just felt this pressure, and you felt other people's pressure, whether they really felt that way or not. It was in your mind. And I just think it's incredible that you continue to heal. And I know that student, it might have it might have made them, feel something, but I'm sure when you talk to them tomorrow that they'll understand. It's probably just play this for them so they will share the story. Say, I want you to sit down and read my story, okay? And then you'll understand why I flipped out a little bit, because you want so much for them. But yeah, and is there anything? And I love how you talked about how we need to see what's hidden in our students. Just because we can't see something doesn't mean they're not struggling with something. Is there anything else you'd like to share about how the fire within impacted you or changed you?
I would actually. So reading everybody else's story, I had the same reaction you did. Honestly, I cried so often reading this story. But then I came across a student poem at the end. And do you remember this, Mandy? So I looked at the name and I went, I know this student. And then I texted her mom. This student's father worked very closely with me at the district level, and he unfortunately died of cancer. And Emily really, really struggled, and we all did. He was just such a gem of a person. But to read her story had me sobbing uncontrollably, had me reach out to her mom. I was so glad I did, and I learned that writing was a process and art, writing and art was a way that she was able to get through her trauma. And so that had an incredible impact on me as well.
Wow.
The student poems are really incredible.
Is it something that we can share? I mean, I don't mind finding it.
It's Emily Arruda, her name is. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was a total coincidence.
It really was.
Well, if we find it and we want to share it, we can.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Sure.
All right, Jen, I'm going to put you down just again, but I'm going to bring you back up. You're still around. I just want to say thank you so much for sharing, being vulnerable. You're doing amazing things, and I need to have you on again just to share all the other amazing things that you're doing. But hopefully you'll stick around, and we'll see you in just a minute.
I will,
oh,
for sure.
Jarod is no longer here.
Oh.
So actually, maybe I'm going to...
Hold me back.
I found Emily's
all right.
poem.
Okay, read Emily's poem.
I don't know if I can get through this.
I don't think I can be on camera for this.
Okay.
I don't honestly know if I'm going to be able to get through this. Okay, I'll try. So the poem is called Have You, Have I by Emily Arruda, age 16. Have you ever looked in someone's eyes and seen glass shattered into a million tiny pieces like it fell with a crash? Have you ever checked and seen the marks on a person's wrists, cuts and burns placed there with no more than a hiss? Have you ever asked someone how they're doing and seen their face fall, but they merely respond with, "There's nothing wrong at all"? Have you ever watched a person begin to cry and stay there as they sat waiting for tears to dry? Have you ever told someone how much they mean to you, but they look at you sadly because they think it's not true? Have you ever had eyes that crash into a million pieces like glass?
Wow. Thank you for reading that.
I
Okay.
almost made it through. I was trying really hard.
You did a good job. You did a good job. All right, we're going to bring up our last contributing author, Mr. Jarod Bormann. It is so good to see you, Jarod, and meet you in person. I said quotations. And for the first time, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing awesome. How are you guys? I'm also emotional from all of the stories. And
I know, right?
so,
Jeez.
yeah,
Well, and it's emotional, but it's also healing in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
And when I was reading your story, Jarod, I was just like, wow. What you were able to reach your students based on the things that you were dealing with. I'm going to let you tell your story a little bit, just the synopsis of Educator of Steel.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to, in some way, shape, or form, make the vignette kind of come full circle and tie it into some kind of metaphor. So I used Superman and my obsession with Superman at a young age and how that kind of came to fruition a little bit. I don't have my glasses on tonight, so otherwise you'd probably think I try to emulate it a little too closely. But
it totally loses the effect. You should have had him on.
So this basically where it stems from is, at a very young age, age of like 3, my parents got divorced. I find out later in middle school, which is like the prime time to learn when your biological father, who when they got divorced was who came out gay. And so you're just kind of thinking like, you're going through all those emotional changes as well as physical changes. And you're like, okay, I have nice handwriting. What does that mean for me? So you have that aspect of it. And then there was a lot of visitation things and so forth. And then fast forward, which I'm not going to lie, try to cover in the amount of time that I tried to cover in a vignette and try to fast forward and give dates and so forth without people getting lost was a little tricky. But later in college is when my biological father reached back out to me. And then we started to develop a relationship and started to see and went and visited him and, saw his life and his partner and just saw the love that they have for one another. And at that time I was essentially engaged to my wife. And so it was all of that kind of then molded my thinking and feeling, and what I would probably say is really strengthened my empathy muscle. And so when I had a student in my own classroom who essentially, expressed his feelings towards me, then, that right away didn't lead me to all of a sudden become super defensive or start to act out in an angry way or, hand it over to the principal and just say, deal with this. It was more like, okay, I understand where this kid is trying to come from. This kid is trying to find himself. He's trying to express things in a very normal, healthy way. And so how I handled that was a little differently than maybe most situations, but especially, and I remember this moment and still remember this moment so vividly when the student, it was myself and I made sure I had another adult with me and having this conversation with the student, just like, okay, all this stuff is normal. It's totally fine. But you realize that, with my role as an educator and your role as a student and so forth, he, of course, then became very, very emotional and very distraught. And when I remember he said, I don't want to be here. The other teacher who was in the room was just like, okay, I think we're done here. And I was like, did you hear what I just heard? Like, so it felt like, with Superman and his super hearing, going through those experiences kind of allows us to develop keener senses. And as we talk about superpowers and so forth, and for me, I felt like in that moment, I was able to hear something that someone else wasn't able to hear. And so I was able to address it a little differently. And I tried to switch the conversation into, how he was a senior. And so how he planned to go on to this particular career field and how that's going to make a huge impact for other people who may also be going through struggles and so forth. And so in retrospect, it was kind of like an opportunity for me to pick up on something that wasn't originally heard and then hopefully be able to change that in some positive way. And it was a very positive experience. We were able to finish out the school year just fine. He still stays in touch with me. So, he still says, hey, thanks. I was obviously going through some things in high school and whatnot, but, so yeah, so it was an experience that of like that. But I think for me, I felt like that was just like the first half. And so I'm going a little bit beyond just the chapter, if that's okay, if we have time.
Please.
Okay. So my story didn't quite end there. We're like, oh, Jarod experienced divorce and then, or being a child of divorce and then, reuniting with his biological dad and, going through that and so forth. So I originally thought like the trauma that I went through was, going through being a part of a really nasty, what I would say kind of a split divorce situation. And that was the trauma. Well, it might've been a piece of it, but in reality, I was also dealing with something else that I could not describe, that I could not for the life of me figure out, like, what is it that really creates this high sense of anxiety and so forth. And so I was still experiencing those kind of things, even after that particular chapter and after writing the vignette for Mandy's book and all of that. And so I found out that I experienced some trauma at 2.5. So before I even had like working memory, which is probably the main contributor of some of the trauma and the anxiety and the depression and so forth. And so I would not have known that though, had I not reunited with my biological father, because it was ultimately a question that I posed to him where he was like, well, there was this one thing when you were 2.5 years old that you experienced. And so then I was like, that makes sense. That's when, like, for me, the pieces all could come together. And then I could use that in, therapy sessions and start the actual healing process after that. So kind of twofold in a way, where my vignette I thought was the thing, but then it turns out it wasn't truly the thing.
I think we need to have a volume 2 is what you're saying, Jarod.
A lot of people have asked me that.
Yeah.
A lot of people have asked me to do a volume 2 that they would love to have contributed to another. I think what happened is we had contributors that paved the way. And once that happened and people saw that other people were like, there is almost like a psychological safety that's created within the book by the way that it's laid out and how people have told their stories. And that psychological safety is almost like extending itself into another version, because people say, oh, well, they're not getting bad feedback on this and people aren't talking about it in a negative way. And so, yeah, I've been asked that a lot to have another volume of that. I was going to say about Jarod's, and I know Jarod very well. We've been friends. He's my adopted introvert.
Adopted introvert? Okay.
Yeah. Jarod's like, I don't know if many people even know this, just because we're not in a lot of the same places anymore, but Jarod's like a brother to me. Like, I absolutely love this man. Like, he is crazy awesome. And but I think what makes Jarod's situation or even situations that happen when we're younger unique is that one of the ways that we discover that we have a root of mental health issues is by paying attention to how we feel in certain situations, and then trying to determine where that happened before. Well, for some of us who experience those things in childhood, we may not know. And we may not remember, and we don't remember for a reason, like our bodies are trying to protect ourselves. But unless you can go back and figure that out, it becomes, it becomes tricky. And with people who have, like with my story for kids who have been abused over time, they develop the complex PTSD, which if you have never looked into that, listeners, I highly recommend that you do, because the difference being that a lot of times complex PTSD symptoms are actually seen as personality traits of that person versus being something that needs to heal. And so that can make it a little different as well. But yeah, so that's what, I was kind of a listener to Jarod's narrative from the point, of the learning about when he was a child. And it was super interesting to me, just from like a researcher of mental health, that was something that came up. That was ultimately one of the causes of his current state of anxiety.
Well, what really stood out to me, Jarod, reading your story, and I don't know you, so this is just kind of like my first impression of you, but I think life is so messy. It is just absolutely so messy, and you take all the crap that we all live through, and not everybody like makes it to the other side. It's true. Some people are stuck in that. It's just it happens. It's sad, and then there's others who keep moving forward, And what really impressed me about your story is that you probably in that moment, because you were able to see what that young man, how much he was hurting. I would have been the other teacher. I would have been like, God, this is so effing uncomfortable. Let's call this. We need to adjourn this. Okay. Like, I think that this is more than what I signed up for. But you saw something, like you saw his life hanging in the balance, and you wanted so much for him that you were even able to put yourself aside, and which was super uncomfortable. Even if it had been the opposite sex, it still would have just been so uncomfortable. And you were able to reach him, and now you guys are still like, in contact, and he's thriving. And it's just, that's just amazing to me. I love that. And I'm so glad you were able to share that.
So a piece of that is, speaking of student poetry, he was in my creative writing class. And so, he just liked writing poetry for fun. And I said, and I like writing poetry too. And I love reading poetry. So like, hey, anytime you want me to read something, let me read something. And his poem did start off like there were definite images that were presenting themselves that were a little on the darker side, or things that I could tell that he was using as like identifiers for himself and so forth. And so I would just leave feedback. And most of my feedback was more like, hey, you could use a line break here, or what if you tried this rhyming scheme or whatever like that. But then I would also kind of leave some things in the margins that were just like, so that this image keeps popping up, what does that exactly mean? And, or like, I'm not sure exactly what this means and so forth. So it wasn't like I was trying to get personal in any way, but it was just like, he felt heard.
Right.
He felt like an adult was hearing him and hearing about what he was saying. And so then eventually the poems started to turn to much lighter, happier tones. And so I was like, oh, okay, he's doing better and so forth. And then that's when it was just kind of I was hit with this, like this letter that he essentially left me. And I was like, oh, I hope he didn't take what I was writing as something else. And so that's when I felt like we needed to have a conversation, not him and the principal or him and someone else. So it was through writing and through poetry in which he was able to feel heard. And I think that's why a lot of us, Mandy, all the same theme. We've, as authors, we're told that we shouldn't be saying those things or saying these stories, but here we are putting them out there and understanding that by doing so, there are many others who are saying, yeah, I hear it too. And so it empowers others is really what it comes down to.
And I love this. I think this is actually, we're talking about poems. There's poems in the book. And then one of our contributing writers just wrote a fantastic and emotional poem and also posed a question. So I'm going to bring everybody back up. All right, Dene and Jen and all of us. And Dene, you posed a question, like, what is the fire within? And then you went ahead and wrote a poem while we were all talking. So do you think that you could share that with us tonight? Would you like to?
Well, I absolutely will. And I have to tell you, this is proof of moments like this, because this doesn't happen. And so I said, you guys were talking, I'm like hearing things in my head. And so I had to write it down. And this actually answers the question for me in my mind, right? So I called it the fire within. And if you want to use it, Mandy, go ahead and take it. It's yours. The fire that rocked every nook and cranny the fire that made us not stay the same, the fire that showed us who we really truly are, the fire that can be seen from both near and far. The hurt that refined me, the problem that changed me, the adversity that built me, the issue that challenged me, became the fire within me. And now I'm not there anymore. But there's a fire within, a fire that burns, a fire that ignites, a fire of passion, a fire that propels me to be the best version of myself, because I know that only I can do that. And I know that somehow the adversity may have been necessary, because now I have the fire within.
Woo! Wow.
That is insanely cool. And I absolutely love it. We may have to like re-upload the book with that in it. So I think
We might have to have a volume 2. I'm
yeah,
just
we
saying.
might. Yeah, it's gonna be. You're gonna have to write the. Yeah, that's so very cool. I'm speechless. And I think for me, the fire within really, like all of those things Dean said, but for me, the fire within really stands for the that feeling that I think all of the contributing authors have, that when people tell you no, or when it's going to be hard, or when you've gone through something you didn't think that you could go through, that feeling of, I can do this. Like whether it's by baby steps or whether it's with help, or, I always talk about needing an ecosystem of support and healing. And like, no matter what it is, it's that feeling in the pit of your stomach that says, keep going. And it's a little bit undescribable, but I feel like people who are resilient understand that, who have gone through adversity and who have come out on the other side. But Melody, why don't you tell us a little bit about your story and how it changed you?
Oh, yeah, I thought I changed it a little bit. I will say, so my story is just, I went through, I had a miscarriage, and it was just at a really terrible time in my life. Everything was off with my marriage, with our finances, and my teaching completely sucked that year. All my scores were crap. I just felt like, God, like I thought I was so much better than this. I thought I was beyond that, actually. And then I just went through a depression, and I had never really experienced a depression like that before. And I just wasn't sure how to get out of that. And, I just wrote about how I just decided the next year for school, because all of us are educators, and we're just like, we always have that in our mind. What can we do? Because none of us were satisfied to stay in the pit. Right. So I don't know, like, I just really started sharing what was happening. I think it's hard to talk about miscarriage, everything that everybody's talked about tonight. Just in the last few years, going through therapy, talking about these things in our professional circle, it wasn't a thing a few years ago.
Mhm.
It's just more common now. And I wasn't sure how to talk about anything. So it was really hard to get out of. But then I realized, like, all the things that just were so challenging were also things, like you had said, Mandy, that actually make you better. I don't know, I just found a piece of me that I'd never known before. And, the next year was like the polar opposite of the year I experienced. But I will say that when this book came out, like I said, I was so glad to be a part of it. But then something else bigger happened in my life. I was reading this book when my husband was going through quadruple bypass surgery. I was 37 years old. This was not something, we had a 6-month-old baby at the time, with 4 other kids. And I just thought, I have to eat my words. Like I put the words, like, we have to be grateful for our challenges, right? We have to appreciate them. I thought, well, I guess here you go, Melody. Is what you wrote true? Are you going to, because there were times when I thought, when we were going through his recovery and his surgery, that I was just like, I didn't think I could do it. Like, I just didn't know that, like, that was just not something. It was actually much more painful and harder to walk through that. But I'm glad for all of it. And I do believe that there is a fire within all of us. It stems from something. For me, it's a spiritual thing. And, my faith grew stronger. And I would say that now I feel like my faith is different than it used to be. I think I have a lot more faith in myself. I always believe there is a higher power. but I just feel like we are so strong and we can, kind of sit in that. It's okay to sit in that a little bit, I think also it used to be like you just had to focus on something else, compartmentalize this crap you're going through and just keep pushing on. And now it's like, and I feel like, Mandy, knowing you, especially because I get to tell you all of my deepest and darkest secrets, and you're just like, Melody, you're normal. It's okay. You're normal. It's okay to sit in it. It's okay to sit in it for a little bit before you find that fire again. And it's not out. The fire is not gone. It's not, you're not just all these ashes and nothing else. There's something that's going to come next. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the phoenix, right?
Amen.
Like the phoenix.
I did, yes. So we have gone a lot over what I normally do, but this was a special edition, so I knew that we would. Is there any last words or thoughts that you'd like to share before we say goodbye?
Well, one thing I did want to mention is that I am working on a companion guide finally. I have been asked about a book study and companion guide for this book forever, and I could not figure out for the life of me how to go about creating a companion guide based on people's narratives. But I think that I have something pretty good going. It's not finished yet. You can access what's there, and I'll make things live as I get it done. But there are a lot of resources for different things in there, whether some of it's from my website, some of it's like Brene Brown stuff, some of it's like just organizations to notice or things to read that are articles based on whatever the author was talking about. And so for example, for Jen references a TED Talk in her story. I actually put that TED Talk on the companion guide so somebody could watch it. Check it out. Again, it's a work in progress for sure. There's a lot of chapters in The Fire Within, so it's taking some time. But it will be done in the next few weeks. Also, from the standpoint of, like I said this in the beginning, the contributors really have a special place in my heart. And I have become closer with many of the contributors after, like some of them I didn't even know when it all started. And I have been forever in debt to people who are willing to share their deepest, darkest secrets published in a book.
Yeah.
and I can't even say the courage that takes is really unspeakable, because to put something out like that, it showed faith in me. It showed faith in Sarah Thomas. And for that, again, just eternally grateful on National Gratitude Day. So I want to make sure that you guys understand that I love you so much, as I do all of the contributors out there for The Fire Within. And we're going to give away 2 books. And I think Jarod's on that side of me. Jarod is also giving away one of his books, Professionally Driven, which is amazing. And so how did you want to give those away?
You know what? We got just a couple of comments, but maybe if you reshare this and just tell us something that you that resonated with you from our talk, and then we can maybe pick it over the next couple of days. And
sounds good.
I want to say thank you to everybody who joined tonight. Jarod, Jen, and Dene, and Mandy. It was so amazing to be here with you tonight. And I want you to have one last chance also to share what's on your heart before we say goodbye, if you want to.
Who's starting?
Anybody.
Yeah. Just that I'm really thankful for the opportunity to share my story. If anything, when anybody says people want to hear that, it gives you a feeling of not just meaning something, but also that you have something to contribute.
I echo. It was very cathartic for me personally to write the story and to be part of something where people are sharing so vulnerably. It just was an incredible opportunity. So thank you.
I don't know if I have anything to add. These wonderful people have said it all.
All right. Well, if you are watching and you share our live on Twitter, probably that's the easiest way, and just share something that resonated, or even in the comments, you're in the drawing, and we will just pick somebody randomly who shares this and something that they resonated. So I will see you again next week with another author. But until then, thank you so much for tuning in, and you guys are amazing. I am so grateful for each and every one of you, and for all of the authors that contributed. Don't leave just yet, because I do want to take a group picture, if that's okay. But yeah, we'll see you guys. See you guys again soon. Bye, everybody.